And that was the latest Star Wars movie. How was it? Amazing! Except when it was kinda dumb. The more I think back to it, the more I do find things wrong with it, but at the same time, the more I think back to it, the more I don't care. The more I think back to it, the more I don't care. The more I think back to it, the more I don't care.
The more I think back to it, the more I don't care.
What orders from Mordor, my lord? What does the Eye command?
We have work to do.
I couldn't believe some of the things they wrote about the prequels, you know? I mean, but really, beyond, I didn't like it. You ruined my childhood, and I'm still angry about the way they treated Jake Lloyd. He was only 10 years old, that boy, and he did exactly what George wanted him to do. Believe me, I understand clunky dialogue. So I almost got hornswoggled in that documentary where they weren't calling it The People versus George Lucas at the time, but I could tell from the questions they were asking me, it was an open invitation to trash George.
George Lucas raped our childhood. 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 George Lucas raped our childhood.
And I have issues with George, but I love that man.
You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun, and you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way. I don't like that. I never did. I started out in experimental films, and I want to go back to experimental films. But of course, nobody wants to see experimental films.
The main thing is to protect these characters. Make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them.
I'm curious that the Force doesn't get muddled into a bunch of garbly-gook.
Can I just say, though, a lot of times I would say to Ryan, we got to think about the fans. And he said, no, we got to think about the story, and we got to think about our movie. Which
Welcome back to Revenge of the Prequels, everyone. Today we are going to take a look at Doug Walker, otherwise known as the Nostalgia Critic. Before we get started, a few personal thoughts regarding Nostalgia Critic. I do actually personally admire his work and the amount of time and effort he and his team put into Channel Awesome's videos. Doug is quite entertaining and charismatic and in all honesty quite funny. I found a lot of enjoyment in his Last Jedi Nostalgia Critic video. My issue with it lies with his lack of consistency, especially given how he bashed the prequels like many others in the YouTube anti-prequel status quo circle jerk. It's time to take a look back at everything wrong with Nostalgia Critic's videos on the beloved prequel trilogy. Now, if you are new to the series and you love the prequels, you'll no doubt enjoy this. And if you hate the prequels, well, you still may find some entertainment, though I would encourage you to go back and watch episode 1 so you understand the intent with these videos. But with all that said, let's get started.
What can I say about the most despised movie prequel in cinema history?
Well, if you want to call it the most despised prequel of history, that would only be because Star Wars has, or rather had, the most populated fan base in Western movie culture, or pop culture. If you want to count the 20,000 butthurt fanboys who had nothing better to do with their lives than bitch about it incessantly online in the AOL chat rooms, that was like 1% of the fan base. The following percentage of sheep didn't really follow suit until one such fanboy as yourself told them to after establishing an early platform for themselves on YouTube. And while it may have been the status quo prior to the Disney era, it wasn't the majority of the fan base, not even close. The majority either had no way to voice themselves or were simply drowned out by the true toxic fandom.
Thumbs way down.
You didn't like it?
No, I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
Or they were too naive to realize the idiot on the internet has no idea what the hell he was talking about. This is why I get annoyed when people passively say that most people hate the prequels, when if you search just about any comment section nowadays, you'll find that is certainly not the case in 2019. And truthfully, I doubt it ever was. Back in 2015, when this video was released, it was peak prequel hate. And it was very common to get chastised for even paying them a compliment.
Well, in my opinion, there is one other thing to talk about. The good stuff. Hear me out.
People now are comfortable freely expressing how much they enjoy the movies thanks to the Disney disasters giving them a leg to stand on.
Well, I can say this. Who has 2 thumbs and totally saw it coming? This guy.
Wait, are you fucking serious right now? You're actually going to claim to have predicted that The Phantom Menace, in your words, was going to be terrible. This is the selling point for your video on a topic which had already been played out at the time? When the internet was full of videos trying to siphon views from this ridiculous trend? No one saw it coming but me.
That's right, I've been waiting years for these bragging rights and now it's finally come. I knew from the first trailer that this was gonna be a bad movie.
Anybody else's bullshit detector just go off?
It just kinda came down to logical deduction. Lucas only directed 1 Star Wars film. And as impressive as it was, it had a lot of problems. The writing was hokey, the acting was stilted, and there's a lot of things that didn't always make sense.
I can, to a certain extent, respect you for taking off the nostalgia goggles, no pun intended. One of the biggest issues with people who criticize the prequels, namely the original trilogy fanboys, is that the same logic for a lot of the arguments can be used in reverse. But let's cut the bullshit, dog. You were sucking George Lucas's dick just like everyone else was at the time. Every single one of them. Something that I engage in quite regularly, in fact. But enough about me, let's keep going.
But he had a lot of people to give him advice and limitations, so it still turned out a good product. Then, years later, after barely directing a thing, this guy is suddenly supposed to direct a masterpiece?
Okay, this is a really stupid argument. Yes, Lucas works better when he has people to collaborate with and give him advice. That's true for every single writer, director, or creator out there. It's true for Christopher Nolan, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and Ridley Scott. And that doesn't mean no one was questioning his decisions on the sets of the prequels. And no, the brief snippets of the documentary can't prove that false. Let's bring up Plinkett's review for a second. His review shows a few snippets which easily could have been taken out of context, not to mention his own interpretation, as he likes to call it.
Later on, after everybody started drinking, Lucas attempts to explain his newly minted bowel movement as bold and extreme, stylistic.
It's stylistically designed to be that way, and you can't undo that, but we can diminish the effects of it.
No one looks like they know what's going on, and they all look like they're about to start pointing fingers. But that's just my interpretation of this footage. I wasn't there.
Without the slightest morsel of humility in the statement, tries to encourage the audience to take his words as facts. Something Chris Stuckman, Jeremy Johns, and I Hate Everything have all done in the past, by the way. And now I guess we can add you to that list. Did George Lucas have more creative control for the prequels than the OT? Yes. Does this mean he didn't collaborate with the people in his staff to refine his work? No. People pass this off as a fact, and it's really annoying. And also lazy as well. Let's not forget lazy.
Though, in all fairness, even I couldn't guess it'd be this bad.
That's because it wasn't, and you can't predict a damn thing. You couldn't predict a death on The Walking Dead if your life depended on it, Doug.
It starts off as Obi-Wan and his master are trying to figure out some sort of political taxation federation stuff that, yeah, like you, I can't figure out either.
You can if you just read the opening crawl and, well, pay attention. But then again, it isn't really that important. The idea behind this is that 2 Jedi have been sent on a covert mission to end a dispute of a greedy trade corporation, cutting off the planet of Naboo from other systems. The reason they are sent is because the bureaucratic landscape of the Republic is useless, so the Chancellor, at the time, sent them in secret to fulfill their role as peacekeepers. But beyond that, this is all you really need to know.
Right. So what is the writing at the start of this one? What's he going to tell our viewer?
Well, most people find it confusing, but basically what it says is that there's a planet, the bad guys have surrounded it.
Planet, bad guys, rounded.
Yeah, surrounded.
Why?
They can't get it. Well, we don't know why. It doesn't make any difference.
It's a $150 million movie. What do you want to know? Yeah.
They're bad guys. What
they're
can
bad
you say?
guys. That's all you need to know now.
Yeah, they're bad guys. And the people on the planet are threatened, and there's a trade dispute. And so they send these 2 Jedi to who are the kind of enforcers of the universe.
Ewan and Liam, we know them.
Yeah, and they come to settle the dispute. And the way they settle disputes is sort of the way the mafia settles disputes. They sort of come in and say, you take half, it's settled, okay, now that's the end of it.
The Jedi expect a quick negotiation, since the Viceroy wouldn't dare fuck with Jedi Knights. But a lot of people forget that the Viceroy doesn't know that they are Jedi in the first place until the droid tells them of their identity. Which I suppose can be a plot contrivance, as they should have maybe dressed up as something different, but then again, that could just be a simple lapse of judgment on the part of the Jedi. To be fair, you never see Jedi dress as anything else when they're on assignment, except Anakin briefly while leaving Coruscant in Attack of the Clones. But that aside, the Jedi expect a quick negotiation and a simple assignment, but everything goes wrong. A negotiation mission turns into a rescue mission. That's literally all you need to know. Now, I could go further in depth, but you didn't decide to provide any substance, so I won't waste any more time on this just yet.
They tried to help the newly elected child Queen Amidala, which you don't elect queens, and queens can't be children, but whatevs.
And who decided that exactly? Was it you? This is Star Wars, mate. George Lucas could have made a fucking cat the king of the galaxy if he wanted to. It's simply a Naboo custom, and her age is never a relevant plot point, and therefore doesn't require explanation in the film. That's what EU shit is for. You know, the extended universe that Disney, in all their fucking wisdom, decided to decanonize.
And along the way, they come across the death of comedy, Jar Jar Binks, and the death of acting, Anakin Skywalker.
Ah, yes. Child Anakin and Jar Jar. Every OT fanboy's favorite crutch when they're whining about these movies. Let's be frank, there's no real valid argument against these two that I've heard besides I just don't like them. Which is fine, perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to not like a character for whatever reason. But how do each of these characters detract from the film exactly? Both serve a crucial purpose to the climax, although I will admit Anakin's involvement in the final battle wasn't written particularly well. But we aren't discussing that at the moment. In terms of their characters, yes, Jar Jar was a more lighthearted comical character for the younger demographic. Whether or not you find him annoying is purely subjective. And he was obnoxious and annoying by design. Hell, even the other characters in the movie found him annoying. So calling him an annoying character really isn't saying much. You need to be more specific. Without Jar Jar, they wouldn't have been able to find the Gungans and form an alliance. And all those saying that Jake Lloyd's acting was terrible and that he was miscast as Anakin, if you're saying that based on his portrayal of the character, you're sadly mistaken. Reason being, it conflicts with another argument that George Lucas had creative control over everything, including the actors and their demeanors. Jake had the demeanor George envisioned for Anakin, a kind-hearted, sweet, naive, but hopeful slave boy, meaning Jake Lloyd's demeanor was a specific design choice. That doesn't detract from the movie in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't contradict anything from the original trilogy or Darth Vader as a character. It simply doesn't adhere to your liking or predetermined vision for what the character should have been. And to say that he should have been anything other than what the creator wanted is invalid criticism because you don't get to dictate the creator's vision. You can only criticize when the creator contradicts himself or breaks his own rules in terms of their writing.
Anakin, it turns out, is a virgin birth. Yeah, can't get any more obvious than that.
I'll agree there partially. And finally, in original criticism, you have no idea how often I've heard the same regurgitated shit over and over and over. I did mention in episode 2 of this series that Lucas has an issue when translating his inspirations subtly into his own creation. For example, the romance of Anakin and Padme was clearly based on Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, among other classic forbidden love stories. None of this is more evident when Anakin is monologuing in the fireplace scene. For more details on that, watch the Star Wars only episode of this series. And after recording this, in actuality, I've actually found some new evidence supporting the fire scene. But that's a topic for another time. The lack of subtlety is why it can be a bit jarring for the audience. But that said, in the case of Anakin's birth, it works well enough in the movie. And is even given some explanation by Qui-Gon.
A boy. His cells have the highest concentration of midichlorians I have seen in a life form. It is possible he was conceived by the midichlorians.
Now, Lucas took the prophecy from the Bible about Jesus Christ and repurposed it as the coming of essentially the Antichrist in Darth Vader. All inspiration comes from somewhere. And while the execution wasn't given much finesse, it's given adequate explanation in the film itself, and again, doesn't break any rules or contradict any as far as I've researched. Other examples for inspiration based on real-world elements include the following. Did you know that the midichlorians are inspired by what we humans possess called mitochondria, which are a means of transferring oxygen into energy within each of your own cells? And there is a theory that we started off as two separate entities before incorporating the mitochondria into our cells as a means of symbiosis. Avada Kedavra is the killing curse in Harry Potter. It's an altered pronunciation of the common magician's term called abracadabra. And I don't recall anyone minded that the Empire were essentially space Nazis in the original trilogy. So wait, you can formulate an argument that George Lucas was racist because of how he portrayed his aliens, but completely ignore the Empire looking and acting and dressing like officers of Nazi Germany? You need your fucking head examined in that case. But yeah, the OT was inspired by real-world events and myths, so the argument against Anakin's birth doesn't really apply unless you're willing to criticize the OT as well. And inspiration, again, needs to come from somewhere. It all depends on the execution and how it's given justification within the movie itself.
And according to a blood test, apparently the Force is very strong with him. Oh, the amount of people this pissed off. Oh, we'll get to that later.
Yeah, midichlorians can measure how Force sensitive you are, dipshit. And I couldn't give two shits less for the 40-year-old rats who threw a bitch fit over it. I wonder how many midichlorians Rey has.
It's over 9,000!
Guess we'll never know. George Lucas says Disney didn't want to use those stories.
I sold them to the white slavers.
Fuck you, Disney. Just fuck you.
They buy Anakin from one stereotype to deliver him to two other stereotypes.
Motherfucker, they're aliens. They can be whatever George fucking wants them to be. And seriously, those clowns who brought race into this were really, really grasping at straws.
All your characterizations are quite definite, aren't they? I mean, where did this one come from?
The movie is pretty neutral. It is in outer space. These are aliens. How in the world you could take an orange amphibian and say that he's a Jamaican? I mean, even the idea of taking his ears and calling them dreadlocks is kind of a strange stretch as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's completely absurd. And what that came out of ultimately was there is a group of fans from the films that don't like comic sidekicks. They want the films to be tough and like Terminator, and they want to be, you know, real guy movies. And they get very, very upset and very opinionated about anything that has anything to do with being childlike, which the movies are for children, but they don't want to admit that, and or a comic sidekick, because they don't want comedy in these movies. And in the first film, they absolutely hated R2 and 3PO. Now Jar Jar is getting accused of the same thing.
I grew up in Australia and I hadn't heard this ridiculous argument until the internet told me when I was in my 20s, so fuck off. Also, no, they didn't buy Anakin. Pay attention. Qui-Gon bargained for him by means of gambling and delivered him to the Jedi Council. Really shows the lack of effort you put into this review, if we can even call it that. The reason why a lot of anti-prequel arguments are weak is because of the internet echo chamber that formerly existed for it. People didn't give two shits if what the person was saying was true or false, just as long as he's trashing a movie they personally didn't like. So the content creator in question puts an extreme lack of effort into his or her argumentation.
We're in cahoots with a senator named Palpatine, who is secretly the Emperor, who wants to get the Queen to sign the treaty because political stuff.
To make the invasion of the Trade Federation legal. That's all we know, and that's all we need to know. It's a plot device that could work in his favor in any number of ways. For example, let's take a look at a couple of scenes.
Negotiations haven't started because the ambassadors aren't there. I have assurances from the Chancellor. His ambassadors did it right. Negotiate. Ambassadors.
Senator Palpatine, what's happening?
They will kill you if you stay. They need her to sign a treaty to make this invasion of theirs legal. They can't afford to kill her.
There is something else behind all this, Your Highness. There's no logic in the Federation's move here. My feelings tell me they will destroy you. There is something else behind all this, Your Highness. There's no logic in the Federation's move here. My feelings tell me they will destroy you. There's no logic in the Federation's move here.
Long story short, Palpatine is the senator of Naboo. He is very familiar with Naboo's customs and politics, and will likely be familiar with Queen Amidala. He'd be very familiar with who she is, being that she is a strong and righteous person. Her weakness, her only true weakness, is to her duty for her people and nothing else. So when he says that Queen Amidala is young and naive,
Queen Amidala is young and naive. You will find controlling her will not be difficult.
he's motivating the Trade Federation viceroys under false pretenses so that they'll invade no questions asked and force her to sign the treaty, legalizing the invasion with ease so they don't get into any shit. If Queen Amidala gets killed either under occupation or trying to escape, he could use the tragedy as leverage against Chancellor Valorum's rule, which is Palpatine's endgame this whole time, ascending from Senator to Supreme Chancellor. So no matter what scenario occurs, Palpatine wins. In all honesty, I can only speculate here, Palpatine didn't expect Amidala to make it to Coruscant. Hell, he sent Darth Maul to capture her and bring her back to Naboo. When she gets to Coruscant, he has to improvise. He manipulates her into conspiring against Valorum, highlighting the bloated bureaucracy will fail her cause unless they have a strong person in power. Again, it's not a perfect setup, but at the same time, there's much to be gained from paying attention. This is covered well in the opening crawl and glimpses of Palpatine communicating with Amidala via hologram, as well as the character dialogue and references to a greater influence behind those events.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I don't sense anything.
It's not about the mission, Master. It's something elsewhere. Elusive.
One of the things I love most about The Phantom Menace is that it actually improves with multiple viewings. When I was younger, I loved it for the flash and the spectacle. As an adult, I love it for the storytelling and the world building. And I didn't have the predisposition of being an original trilogy fanboy.
We get sword fights, gun fights, space battles, and through all of it, I have no idea what they're fighting for.
They're trying to get greedy aliens with a robot army off their fucking planet. That was clear to me ever since I was 5. How old are you exactly? The reason? Well, they are the Trade Federation. They deal with intergalactic trade, I'd assume. They have seized control of the planet out of greed, at the behest of a Sith Lord. They have sealed off communications from the planet. They established a trade blockade from approaching trade ships, likely fucking up Naboo's economy. And they occupied their capital city of Theed, forcing the planet to live under martial law until their demands are met. That much I gathered as an adult, and you would too if you actually gave a shit in this review.
But who cares, right? In the original, it was just an evil empire. We didn't really know their politics. They were just kind of evil, so maybe we can just do the same thing here, right?
Excellent! He took off the nostalgia goggles.
Well, that would work if the characters were the least bit interesting. And by God, are they not. My complaints are your complaints. The acting is so wooden, the writing so 5th grade, the effects way too computer generated, the comedy way too kindergarten.
Let's start with the computer generated bullshit argument first. First off, The Phantom Menace had arguably more practical effects than the entire original trilogy combined. That retarded anti-CGI Nazism argument holds about as much weight as a fart in outer space. The city of Theed? Practical. Naboo's palace? Practical. Tatooine and the slave quarters? Practical. The battle droids and the Federation tanks? Actual models in existence. The pod racers? Actual models they built. Hell, the Naboo starfighter explosion in your very video that you showed to prove this point, you guessed it, absolutely practical. The CGI argument applies only to Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, as they were heavily used in effect as a stylistic choice by George, who wanted to experiment. And let's be frank, back in 2000 and 2001, no production dared to push the boundaries like George and his team did. Hell, ILM had to invent some of the technology themselves. Pursuing a stylistic choice, or more accurately, pioneering one, should be commended, not condemned. Now, as for the characters, well, to be frank, The Phantom Menace isn't heavily focused on character. The main character, or characters, because yes, there can be more than one, is Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. George Lucas has gone on record saying that they're POV characters, vessels for the audience to observe the world through their eyes. Similarly to C-3PO and R2-D2 in A New Hope. Now, I wasn't able to provide the footage because I don't have the means, but on the Phantom Menace Blu-ray, you can find it in the audio commentary with George Lucas and Rick McCallum, the producer, at the beginning of the film during the Trade Federation sequence. Now, with all that said, that's not to say that there's no depth to them. Hell, Qui-Gon is one of my favorite characters in Star Wars for the following reason. He is a Jedi Master, but he isn't a blind slave to the Jedi Code, which, as we come to learn later in the trilogy, is significantly flawed. Much like other retarded logic that I will dissect one day. With that said, Qui-Gon constantly defies the Council and follows his own moral compass. He never breaks the rules, but he's not opposed to bending them.
You and the Naboo form a symbiont circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this.
No caring about Naboo.
And speed is on our way. We could use a transporter. The Gungans will not be easily swayed. And we cannot use our power to help her.
While, on the other hand, his apprentice Obi-Wan is much more subservient to following the rules, which is why he and his master have a conflict of ideals throughout the film. And this actually gets brought up again by Count Dooku in Attack of the Clones.
Qui-Gon Jinn would never join you.
You forget that he was once my apprentice, just as you were once his. He knew all about the corruption in the Senate, but he would never have gone along with it if he had learned the truth as I have.
As for their monotone acting, that is a design choice by Lucas. Again, Lucas had control over everything, right? And the Jedi are meant to be emotionless, as explained by Yoda in the movie. No fear, attachment, anger, compassion, hate, or love. Rejecting Anakin for being too old when he was just a kid at the time is another excellent part of the world building, since it recontextualized the Jedi to being indoctrinated to think this way since early childhood. And this accounts for the whole Jedi Council too, and eliminates such arguments as they're all boring and Mace Windu is bland and boring. How else would you expect them to be? Queen Amidala is monotone and assertive when she is the queen. When she's just Padme, she shows a much more human side because she's not being observed as a monarch. And Anakin is never monotone. He emotes many times, showing his excitement, joy, and sadness. The Queen's captain is another static character. He's always overly serious and has a lot of good one-liners. And yes, Jar Jar is probably the most dynamic of all the characters, but again, The Phantom Menace is not primarily a character-driven story, it's a setting-driven story. A chain of events occur, and these characters are along for the ride. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan again, POV characters, while all the important stuff is happening elsewhere around them. The important characters of the story are Anakin and Padme, and it shows.
You're thinking people gonna die?
I don't know.
Gungans get pasted too, eh?
I hope not.
Will I ever see you again? What does your heart tell you? I hope so. Yes.
Not every story has to be character driven. And again, you don't get to dictate the guidelines for what a franchise should and should not be. Star Wars doesn't have to be character driven. A character driven story is a status quo. It's ideal, but it's not the only way to tell a story. And saying that the characters are hollow and uninteresting simply because it's not character driven isn't as simple as ticking off a box. You need to judge case by case. If the director/writer wants you to focus on the characters and the climax of the film strives for an emotional payoff for a specific character but you don't feel it, then the director has failed. Captain Marvel, funnily enough, is the best example I can give, because the climax banks on you feeling inspired by her emotional journey coming to a head. But her entire childhood of male oppression is glossed over entirely, except for glimpses of flashbacks that are over in less than 30 seconds. So the film fails miserably to achieve what it set out to do. The Phantom Menace is centered around a series of events. The main protagonists are the catalyst for the events occurring, but they aren't the main focus. And I'm of course referring to Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. Qui-Gon dies, but his death, while sad, isn't overly emphasized. His death is mostly glossed over in actuality, and the focus turns to Obi-Wan. Qui-Gon has a dying wish for his decade-long apprentice, and yes, that length of time has been explained and implied through the world building. And at his funeral, the characters are all discussing things not concerning Qui-Gon at all. But they are all in the room together because of Qui-Gon. And that's the important thing to take away. The send-off for Qui-Gon, as well as his development, is appropriate for his role in the grand scheme of the trilogy. Same as Darth Maul. It's not a setup without an adequate payoff because Darth Maul had zero relevance to the rest of the trilogy. Anyway, to end my point, not every character needs to be dynamic to connect with them on some level, and not every story has to be character-driven. Every story must be judged case by case.
The stereotype's way too offensive. Yeah, what else can I say about this that every other person on the planet hasn't said?
Again, the aliens can be whatever they want. If you see stereotypes within them, I think that says more about you than it does about the creator. And anyone who was offended by the alleged stereotypes in a Star Wars movie, well, they can suck a big fat dick for all I care. Also, there's a lot you can say that others haven't said. You just don't care to because you honestly don't give a shit. You're just regurgitating a hot topic for the sake of views. Here, look at this. Your whole Star Wars review week was a last-minute attempt to cash in on the prequel hate before The Force Awakens came out. So why would you give a shit? Prequel hate for attention back then was as common as I hate Trump is today to garner attention, regardless of the substance or lack thereof in your arguments.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robert De Niro.
I'm going to say one thing. Fuck Trump.
Well, I guess I'll try to defend it a touch, as everybody acts like this is the worst thing ever made, and it's not.
Wow, not bad, Doug. Not bad. A little honesty goes a long way with yours truly. I take my hat off to you for that.
And then we're gonna find our best friend Doug, and then we're gonna give him a best friend hug.
It's just a bad movie coming off the heels of some of the most popular films ever made. As tiring as the constant CG gets in this, there are a lot of very neat landscapes. The worlds are very creative and very beautiful to look at. The sword fights got a lot better too. Remember when Darth Vader and Obi-Wan were just kind of tapping those light sticks together? Well, now this is a straight-on battle. And it looks amazing. It's still impressive even years later. And whether you see it as a good thing or a bad thing, there is something interesting watching a guy's dreams suddenly come to life with nobody getting in the way. It's a fully realized vision with no filters whatsoever. And as someone that loves film and artists, it's interesting to see. It just so happens it's not very good, but it's still interesting. Was this always planned from the beginning? Probably not, but it's also kind of neat to see the changes he'd want to make, and yeah, what happens when a filmmaker stays away from his craft so long?
It turns out many of Lucas's ideas for the prequels were actually mentioned during the period of the original trilogy. But regardless, Lucas was away from his craft for a long time, all things considered. Given what he was able to accomplish, he should be commended, not condemned. Whether or not you think the prequels are good or bad, although if you've come this far in the series, I imagine I've given you a warmer impression of them, you cannot tell a creator how to create. For that much, Doug, we are in agreement.
I can even make a small argument for the midichlorians. It's been proven that a lot of people that seem to have a spiritual essence or a lot of energy, the water in their blood is affected. So in a very slim way, you could kind of make the argument that this is credible and doesn't get in the way of the philosophical and religious aspects, but even I admit it's very, very slim.
Well, I can give credit for that original attempt to justify the midichlorians, but again, I've already covered it and I'll mention it again here. Midichlorians aren't the Force. They are a means of measuring the Force. The Force is still ambiguous as an entity, and Qui-Gon is even quoted saying that the midichlorians are in all life, and without them, life could not exist, which doesn't at all contradict what Yoda said about the Force being all over the place and binding the universe together in Episode 5.
I'm just trying to offer an interesting point of view. But yeah, like everyone, I thought this was a turd also.
Like some, Doug. Like some, you thought this was a turd also. Let's make that clear. You're not in the category of the majority, especially in 2019. Feel free to pretend that you are, as I'm sure the fanboy echo chambers back in 1999 thought they were also. The majority love or at least like the movie. If you don't believe me, again, just browse the comment sections on modern day Star Wars videos on YouTube. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's one of my biggest guilty pleasures. I just can't help but browse Star Wars videos and go to the comment sections and read the staggering amount of dated comments that have just aged so poorly.
The story's too complicated for kids to follow, and the dialogue is too childish for adults to follow.
Kids will enjoy it for the flash and the spectacle. Adults can enjoy it if they pay attention, instead of adhering to the internet status quo back in 2015. Also, that's rather presumptuous, assuming that children who want to enjoy the movie won't grasp an understanding of the politics involved.
So unlike the original three, where it spoke to both, this one speaks to neither.
In a nutshell, the original trilogy was a much more condensed, simplified, character-driven trilogy than the prequel trilogy, although I would say A New Hope follows a similar beat to The Phantom Menace, at least in terms of its structure. And again, that depends on the individual. If something appeals to them, you can't say that it was an absolute. So quit trying to pawn it off as such.
I'm hearing more and more that there are a lot of kids that grew up with this because, hey, they like Jar Jar, they like poop jokes, and they like a lot of the visuals. Which is interesting when you watch them grow up and realize that the original three films were much better than this.
First of all, if any fan of the original trilogy said that Star Wars was never about the visuals for them and that it was all about the characters and the themes and the emotion, those pathetic bastards are lying to their teeth. Do I sound like a hypocrite yet? Good, because I'm mirroring what Doug is claiming and what I just spoke out against. Falsifying the opinion of some as an absolute. Not everyone who grew up liked the OT better than the prequels. In all honesty, Return of the Jedi is my least favorite of the original 6 films, and The Empire Strikes Back is my favorite. That's not to say I hate Return of the Jedi, because I still adore it, but everyone is different, which is my point. I personally think Empire is the best objectively in how well the story flows and is put together, but that can change with new information. And regarding The Phantom Menace, I hope I provided some for all of you throughout this video response.
Honestly, the most entertaining thing about this film is the fan reaction. The fact that people waited days in line and then were in such denial when they found out it was bad. They didn't even admit it was bad. They tried to bargain with themselves and be convinced that it was actually good, but over time, nobody could defend the poop jokes.
And just for the record, the only reason I had any negative thoughts pertaining to The Phantom Menace to begin with is because I, like many other sheep, let someone with over 1 million subscribers trick me into believing it was bad. But you know what? When the same person tricked me into believing something was good, I started to think for myself. And here I am in 2019, proudly defending poop jokes.
Nobody could defend the racial stereotypes.
And proudly defending alleged racial stereotypes.
As much as critics at the time actually tried to say this was a good movie, yeah, look up the reviews at the time, they tried to defend it, it showed in full view the power of hype, and how long it took for so many people to admit the Emperor has no clothes.
Okay, if that was meant to be funny, it didn't really land. And yeah, reviews at the time were good and still are, especially in 2019. Again, for the third time, check the comment sections.
Honestly, in many respects, it's kind of an important movie for that. It shows that artists are flawed and there is no perfect project. Hell, even the original Star Wars had a lot of stilted acting and hokey dialogue. For a lot of fans, this was the bursting of the bubble, the ending of the fairy tale, the having to face real life.
Not all of them.
But there's advantages to that too. It tells people that, hey, you don't have to be perfect to make good stuff. You can learn, you can change things, you can make stuff better. Even your heroes aren't always your heroes. And that's okay, you can be inspired to do better work. If you're one of those people that claim Lucas killed your childhood, you never had a childhood to begin with. Or you're constantly trying to stay in it and reject your grown-up world.
And those were the retards people reference as a credible review for this film? The ones who were the most butthurt? That's kind of pathetic if you ask me. And yes, I'm perfectly aware that me making this response series can be seen as butthurt, but fuck it, I'd rather be a free thinker than another sheep. And I'm enjoying every second of serving up some prequel justice, baby.
Bottom line, he got his vision made, and it sucked, but at least he got it made exactly how he wanted it. It still did well at the box office, so you can't claim it's a waste of money. But yeah, after years of spin-off books and spin-off games and so much that was being done with the Star Wars universe that Lucas had little involvement with, did I expect a lot more? Oh yeah.
You just criticized people for overindulging in their own hype.
But it's still such an interesting turnout in how strange and awful it is that it's kinda something to analyze. We'll never know, was it just too many yes men, or was he away from filming too long, or was he never really that talented to begin with, it was just other people that made it work? It's one of the great mysteries that's fun to speculate. And if you like it, great! I wish I could have such an innocent mind not to see all these offensive stereotypes. I'm sure he thought he was doing some sort of clever commentary, but if you don't see how this movie can piss off a lot of people, enjoy it. You're definitely part of a rare minority.
You serious?
And don't let anyone take that away from you. But for me and a lot of other people, it's as if the voices of millions of people cried out in terror and were suddenly never given their money back.
Finally, we made it through the first Nostalgia Critic video. That one was rough. You know, I wouldn't have to go into so much detail if he gave even the slightest ounce of nuance in these piece of shit mini reviews he does, but there's big gaps to fill and there's a lot to say, so I'm sorry that took so long. Hope you all enjoyed the show. I can't wait to see you again for part 2 when we tackle Nostalgia Critic's Attack of the Clones video. I'll see you then. You guys take care. Bye for now.
The main thing is to protect these characters. Make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them.
I sold them to the white slavers.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since